Goeienaand. Greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, here to shine a light on the goings-on down south and at the southern tip of Africa and how that affects the wider Western world. And joining me here tonight for that interesting topic is a person or a guest that I don't think I think most of my audience is very well familiar with, and that is Mr. Robert Duigan. He's probably one of the guests that I've had the most on as a guest on this platform, but he always has fascinating insights, and tonight's topic is definitely one of those topics where Rob has written a lot on it, he's tweeted a lot on it, and he's also said a lot on it. He experienced a lot of it through his experience at UCT, but then also in the years following. So welcome on the show. Welcome back, Rob, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, hi, how you doing?
I'm good, man, and you?
Oh, tired. Little children's are making my day more colorful, but certainly leaving me a bit calorie depleted. So, yeah.
Absolute blessing, though. I wish all the best for you and your family, and that you survive this exhausting time, but rewarding time nonetheless.
Yeah.
All right. So tonight's topic is specifically it's not based on some current events or any big news story that broke recently. It's just something that I've been thinking about quite often this year. And it's again the link between what happens in South Africa and how it almost gets some of the ideas and activism and ideologies from here get exported, get a little bit disfigured along the way, or get transmuted into something else, but it ends up in Western countries, and there it takes on a life of its own. But again, this is a simplification. This is not to say that every single policy or ideology or activist movement that you're going to see in the West always starts in South Africa. There's just a very clear link there. But it's also there's also a theme that I think I want to touch on in this conversation, and that's the infatuation that the Western world seems to have with South Africa. It goes through these phases on the macro scale and the micro scale when it comes to time. So on the macro scale, you have these big epochs or moments where the Western world is absolutely infatuated with South Africa, to the point where the country becomes almost like a central theme within the talking points or cultural war there. You can think of the most prominent examples would be the Anglo-Boer War completely capturing the imagination of many Europeans and European countries. Then later in the next century, you have apartheid becoming this major political talking point all across the West, and people are actively zeroing in on South Africa, seeing what's going on here. And then naturally the last big one, I think, was 1994, the transition into ANC rule and to a majority democracy. So I think, and that's the last time where there was this massive focus. Now in our time, you have on the micro scale, you do have these little blips on the radar where Julius Malema killed the Boer, kill the farmer to 90,000 people in a stadium, or Elon Musk makes a tweet about it, or for example, Donald Trump mentions South Africa or farm murders. So you have these little blips, but there is this infatuation. But we'll get to that a little bit later in the conversation. I want to start first with the link between policies and ideas starting in the primordial political soup here in South Africa, and then kind of spreading to other Western countries. And the best example there, and that's why I wanted to talk to you, Rob, is I think Rhodes Must Fall, the whole toppling of statues, the whole genesis of that movement. Now, it's not the first time in human history that statues have been toppled, but I think you'll agree with me when I say it's one of the place where the idea of toppling colonial statues or statues deemed to be oppressors of the past are kind of entered the pop culture of the Western world, and you were at the center of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll definitely grant you that, but I think increasingly with time, I've come to the impression that it's kind of the other way around. In that, look, I mean, certainly we're sort of like the way I'd put it is like South Africa's a funhouse mirror for the West, where you can kind of see a lot of a lot of Western politics and political ideas and trends reflected in South Africa, but they're like all distorted and the proportions are wrong. So the West kind of thinks they see something that looks the same, but in reality, it's kind of a bit different. But there are some commonalities. I mean, I'll go back to Rhodes Must Fall in a second, but I wanted to just sort of draw a little theme here, which is that there are common points that South Africa shares with the other big settler colonies. So that would be, you know, parts of South America, certainly the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Because they're settler colonies, you have this sort of Western thing that comes with a lot of people who settled in a discrete area. And this is a thing that you find is true of any place that Germanic peoples have settled, or Protestant actually would probably be more accurate. Anywhere where Protestant people have settled, the general pattern is that Protestant settlements tend to want to be separate from the natives, whereas the Catholic colonies tended to have an integrationist perspective with, and so you'll find, like, I don't know, if you look at the island of Hispaniola, whether it's the French side or the Spanish side, the colonies over there, there's lots of interbreeding, and then they said they had a sort of like caste system. And in Mexico, you can still see, and indeed even in Cuba, which supposedly has this very egalitarian communist thing, you've got whites on top, and then you've got, you know, it gets browner the lower down the social hierarchy you go. And over here, we sort of separated ourselves out. The Cape gets really complicated because the Cape actually, ironically, periodically bounced between the, you know, what I'd call the Protestant model and what would be called the Catholic model. So you have this vacillation between sort of integration with a class system and then separation with a racial system. So the Cape gets very complex and weird. So I won't go there because that undermines the main point. The general pattern for South Africa is that you have white communities and black communities for most of its history. And the same is true of the United States. There are white communities and black communities, and the two were segregated. So they had that. And if you look at native policy, Canada and the United States also had this thing of like, okay, well, they live over there in these reserves. And we said, oh, we're also going to have native reserves. They sit over there. And the consequence is that a lot of the thinking from one country to another, we'll look over at them and see something we like. They look over here and see something they like. And now that the whole sort of colonial and white supremacist era is over, you've got the different paradigm where everyone's trying to integrate everything and trying to legitimize the political community across races in a sort of centralized state fashion. And as we all know, if you've got any kind of separate ethnicity beneath the state that wants to do its own thing, it's a threat to state authority. And the reason that doesn't really hold for the old apartheid state is that unlike the rest of the countries that I've been describing, there came a point in sort of, let's say from the 1960s and onwards, where people in positions of power were starting to realize, well, there are aspects, if you look at the demographic balance, the black population growing at a certain rate, their wages are rising much faster than white wages. The system of Boskap is unsustainable. And even to a certain degree, I think it was noticed in the 1930s and 40s, because there was a sort of Malthusian crisis caused by the inability to industrialize their farming sector quickly enough. The black areas suffered food shortage crises. So in order to remedy that, we had to integrate our economies a bit more. And so you get this, something happened in South Africa, I think in the mid-century, and it's broad, so different people realized it at different points, different departments in the government did. And I think the only point at which at the highest level of politics everyone agreed that the whole polity couldn't be indefinitely sustained in the fashion that it had was in 1977. And so in 1977, you start getting, well, how do we integrate the economy in a way that gives us an option to protect ourselves and defend our position in society with black franchise? And that question started being tackled in earnest in 1977, when Forster decided on a whole bunch of things. He decided to embargo the Rhodesians in order to try and curry favor with the West. They also started removing the color bar in various different sectors. They also decided at a high level that they couldn't sustain the educational policy that they were moving with with Verwoerd. They said, like, okay, well, there's a really good sort of collection of essays on this by a bunch of lefties put together in 1990.
Also, during that time, you have the adoption of a détente approach to all other African countries from South Africa's side, trying to ease and create all these.
It doesn't work. Yeah, exactly, and it doesn't work. I mean, it's like, you pay the Dane geld, you get the Dane. It's the acts of appeasement didn't really appease anyone. They just accelerated the process, because it's like, okay. Lenin put it really well. You advance with the bayonet, and when you encounter mush, you push, and when you encounter steel, you retreat. Or you don't. Well, you stop anyway. And so we gradually tried to. The reason that South Africa's exception makes an exception in that we tried to sacrifice some territory in order to minimize the amount of black people that would eventually be included in a modern democratic South Africa. And there were 4, I think it was Transkei, Bop, Venda, and Zululand would eventually supposed to go their own way. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Zululand. It was what was that acronym again? That doesn't matter. Anyway, so that all failed. As we know, in 1993, the last little domino fell, and Bob was taken over, and Mangope is gotten rid of. Now we have this new country, and there's a lot of people asked this around this time on the right, who were asking a very specific question: why was the West backing the ANC all of a sudden from about 85-ish onwards? And they were scratching their heads and couldn't figure it out. Now you read these sort of like revisionist historians from around this area. The best example of this thinking is Klaus Vake. He wrote a book called The Plot Against South Africa. And it's very reactionary. I mean, this is someone who takes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion seriously, which is, don't worry about it. But it paints a certain picture of a thought at the time. So, and he gets a lot of things wrong. In fact, he gets most of his projections, he gets quite wrong. And the big one he gets wrong is that he said that the aim of the West, because they're doing this, they must be aiming for global communism. The United States is about to merge with the Soviet Union. There's going to be global communism everywhere. Completely nuts. But the real explanation is much more interesting. And it's easy to see with hindsight. And that is that Russia was opening up, and they'd realized they couldn't hold their system together for a number of reasons. And because of the backdoor communications between East and West, the West knew this as well. And what this triggered in the big decision makers in places like Council of Foreign Relations and everything is, we can make a new world. We can sort of finish this progressive liberal model that we invented after the Second World War. And you can also sort of say they invented it under Roosevelt's government, FDR. Sort of this very sort of centralized, state-driven, public-private partnership, welfare state, Keynesian economics, blah, blah, blah. Like Keynesian economics, I'm going to have to blur the edges there for what happened in the 90s. But what they generally looked at, and there was a thinker who came up with this, formulated it perfectly, and his name, a man called Anthony Giddens, and he was a luminary of the Fabian Society. Now, the Fabian Society is very old. It's a socialist movement from the late 1800s. But they didn't follow what we call communism or Marxism. They had this idea of a sort of integrated society with full employment, fully made completely efficient, and driving humanity to make it evolve, right? So there's a Darwinistic element that's not kind of explicitly expressed. But this particular form of socialism was driven through the middle classes. And as a consequence, it wasn't very keen on seizure of industry or anything dramatic like that. They focus on like blurring the boundaries between institutions. So you get more of a swampification of society. And the guy who really came up with the model that we have now is Anthony Giddens. And he pushed a lot of sort of NGOs are a great motor of this. And South Africa, the parallel we see in South Africa is the movement, the UDF. So that gets you a really, really interesting model. And I don't know to what extent he borrowed from it as an idea. I know he mentions it at one point in the book, but it's not heavy emphasis. But there's a fantastic parallel here, which is that the main driver of change in society was this civic society movement that allowed radical ideas a way of breaking through into creating reform. And the governments in the 1990s, now two of Anthony Giddens' followers, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, came to power in the 1990s, both members of the Fabian Society. And they created this whole new way of doing business, both nationally and internationally, and used it as a weapon of the state. So instead of it being like a sort of, how should I put it, an outsider or rival group that uses non-governmental civic organizations to change things, we as a state can go and fund a cluster of NGOs to change a society through its civic sector and engineer a democratic revolution. And they practiced this a bit with some of the former Soviet bloc, or in a rusty sort of way. I think Solidarity in Poland was a big part of the testing ground for this. But they had this eventually became, over the years, it became the sort of color revolution model. And I think if you look at the UK, you've got this whole cluster of like what they used to call quangos. The government funds like some charity, and the charity writes this policy and lobbies for it through the parliament. So you've got like the civil service is hijacking parliament through a third party, and then major corporations get clustered into permanent committees that then negotiate with the state in this way. And now South Africa is very interesting because we've blurred the boundary between private and public in a way that's absolutely extraordinary. It's only really comparable.
The biggest cheerleaders for the national health insurance, basically the nationalization of all private healthcare and outlawing of private healthcare in South Africa, are the big private healthcare corporations.
There you go. And you'll notice that Ramaphosa's reforms are almost universally like this. He never goes, we'll just do communism. And he's never like, we're going to privatize everything. No, it's the special third option, this third way, where you go, what we do is we bring the private sector under control of the government and give private sector actors a say in the policy. So you permanently bind together the high levels of the economy with the government. And the ANC brings a third element in here, which is racial quotas. Now, the West has only started doing this very recently with something they call ESG. Although nowadays they're trying to play down the label while keeping the policy.
It just keeps changing. The label changes, but the policy doesn't. You just when people get wise to a label, it just gets phased out and replaced with something new. You see it over and over again.
Right. And I mean, it's not only that, but I mean, certain ideas take on a life of their own and they can challenge power. So there's a big theory that's happening on that's sort of being passed around the dissident right in America and the UK at the moment, which is the idea of what they call putting the woke away. And this is the idea that the sort of big centers of power in the West are are trying to put pressure on various media organizations, activist organizations, corporations, whatever, to put away all of the more disturbing policies of what we call woke, because for two reasons. Number one, it's driving normal people onto the right. And number two, actually, there's a third reason, which is more difficult to fix. Number two, it's emboldening a whole bunch of left-wing activists that are very disruptive to the power process. So, I mean, you saw in the UK, you had Jeremy Corbyn coming up, and you had in the US, you had Bernie Sanders. So occasionally you have these figures that will come up and they'll have genuine left-wing ideas that disturb the balance of powers of the elite. They're not good ideas, but they certainly are, disruptive. So you've got to find a way of containing these energies, and you have to sort of disempower them. And you look across the Western world. I mean, yeah, Biden's got still got a lot of woke stuff going on, but in the UK, you can definitely see it. The Labour Party, Keir Starmer. I'm more common sense on the gender question. Maybe we shouldn't be pushing it onto children so much. All of this kind of stuff that. I had a friend of mine who's got contacts in the UK telling me the Labour Party are even sort of growing less sympathetic of the ANC over time. So that's an interesting dimension. But I think there's constant parallels with this because we have a common narrative that the entire West shares. It becomes distorted when you reach South Africa, but white people imbibe it to a greater degree. And this is the idea of the Second World War being a war between, this universalist liberal democracy and, genocide and white supremacy. The reality is not really that cut and dried. I mean, most of the West was still fairly solid about, I wouldn't call it racial nationalism, but those would be the words they talk about because, you talk about the French race, the English race, and so on. Mm. And you'd actually talk about the American race, funnily enough. So this sort of thing was actually a war between nationalities.
So Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about the Boer race when he wrote about the Anglo-Boer War.
He did, yeah, he did. So this is the way that they were thinking at the time. It was, in a sense, it was a race war between Germans and Anglophones. But there's a higher level game that's played at the level of finance and geopolitics, where the United States financed the industrialization of the Soviet Union, didn't make them pay war debts for it, mainly because their primary aim in the interwar period was taking over the British Empire, which they largely did through commerce, financing the takeover of industry in its colonies and indeed back home in Britain itself. And then when the war came around, instead of doing them the kind of favors they did for the Soviet Union, they forced Britain to go into debt to get this kind of war financing, which they only paid off, 2017 or whatever the year was, 2009. I can't remember. Sometime in my lifetime. And they used that to bundle up the whole sort of British empire. And the thing about this anti-imperial policy drive that the Americans were going for, and the way in which they combated the Nazis in Germany after they got rid of them. Now, the complete totalitarian reordering of society, re-educate all the Germans, get rid of this, get rid of that. And it had to be ideological because they couldn't actually get rid of everyone who participated in the regime because it included everyone with technical skills. They clearly realized something even the ANC hasn't, which you kind of have to hang on to the engineers and the doctors, So
they poached the engineers and the scientists, even the Americans and the Russians from
correct. They actually cared about making things work, so they had to compromise in a few places. But the ideological program they pushed through in Germany became the blueprint for a lot of things. And so the ideas, the intellectuals who came up with these ideas that were promoted by the American occupational forces, this didn't happen in Japan for a number of reasons that I won't go into, but I'm reading a very exciting book on that period. So it's on my mind. But they did this to Germany, right? And to the rest of the European powers, they did, well, you will decolonize because we are setting everyone free. So these two things of at the same moment, you have this crystallization of nationalism is evil and colonialism is evil. but only when done by sort of the white right. Now that becomes really interesting, because in the competition with the Soviet Union in the occupation of Germany right afterwards, they started having a culture war battle immediately. And in order to demonstrate to Europeans that American power was actually worthwhile, they had to demonstrate that Americans had culture. So they put on big shows, concerts, operas, music, whatever. And they sort of think, well, what is an American art form that's different and doesn't have all of these European characteristics? Modern art, abstract art, all of that, right? So they push Jackson Pollock, all that, very centrally coordinated, huge financing. I mean, the modern art movement exists because it was astroturfed by the CIA. But the consequences of this competition with the Soviet Union is that the Soviets kind of said, but you hate black people. You segregate, you've got Jim Crow, all that. And they said, no, we get on fine. Look at how much we love our musicians. We're gradually working to reform ourselves. So then solving the civil rights problem became an issue of geopolitical power. And, and then that started to get an energy of its own. Because the second you're getting rid of that, you've got to say, well, how do you can solve the government problem. How do you prevent people from self-segregating? So now you get the Civil Rights Act, which is causing endless problems today because, they have to force people to integrate, and you can't allow people to select their own neighborhoods. You can't allow
freedom of association.
Right. And I mean, it's not like in South Africa where you've got like these language barriers where people will inevitably sort of sort themselves by language, and you can't say you're discriminating on the basis of language.
But that ideology of forced integration still has taken root in South Africa through the whole the transformationists, as Professor Koos Malan calls it, the whole ideology of transformation. Every facet of society has to be a perfect reflection of the demographic realities of the country, and even as the demographic reality shifts, if those facets need to adapt to the shifting demographics almost in tandem.
Yeah, so it becomes a sort of vicious circle, because the more you sort of press down on one group in order to equalize them, the weaker they get, and you eventually embolden a set of people whose habitual exercise of political organization and self-expression and so on is predicated by sort of racial self-promotion, unbridled,
But
and what you're seeing in this transformation is
the equity bill wanted to pretty much create a scenario where it's literally impossible to employ a colored person in the province of Limpopo, because the demographic reality is there is almost no colored people living in the province.
Right, so they rounded down to zero. I mean, look, these absurdities like that are part and parcel of centralized governance. There's a whole book on this by James Scott called "Seeing Like a State." Now, he's a sort of like center-left anarchist type vibe, but he's made a great observation on the way that having a large organization forces you to rationalize the way you look at the world, but it's like a simplification. And that simplified way of looking at the world ignores on the ground realities, and it's sort of like everyone's fingers get caught in the machine, and you do a lot of stupid things in order to try and make the world rational. And then people who are affected by it can't articulate themselves because they're not speaking your ideological language. So the state, this is a fundamental problem of the state, but the ethnic competition dimension. The thing is, we have lived for the past 70 odd years under America's sort of ideological regime, which is, trying to balance liberty and equality and all of these kind of things. And again, and the other dimension is trying to end international war. And these all sound like very noble goals, but the consequences of trying to engineer a world in which you don't have inequality, you don't have ethnic differences, and you don't have national conflict is a world in which you increasingly have to suffocate everything under more and more pressured bureaucracy and crooked balancing acts. The fact of the matter is that competition and conflict, they're unavoidable. They're unavoidable. They're part of life, and life has all of these tragedies, and you can't get rid of. So, I think I think the thing of like saying, okay, well, South Africa feeds America and America feeds South Africa. Yeah, it's definitely true, but I think it's because we both see ourselves on the white part of the population anyway, see ourselves as being on the same journey. We're trying to we're trying to fulfill the ideas of the Enlightenment. We're trying to say, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So no more wars, no more conflict, no more inequality, and
bridges, not walls.
Right, but then the freedoms that are easier to solve as the state, if you're the state, are the sort of like, I don't know, the power that your father will have over your life, the power that your church will have over your life, the power that your community will have over your life. You can solve those problems as a state. But then you create a certain problem in that you're tethered to the state, you're dependent on it. That becomes the source of everything for you, right? You're an individual who can no longer rely on anybody. I mean, take, for example, like, Theodore Dalrymple writes about this shit a lot, right? About the decaying effect that welfare dependence has on society. So because you don't rely on your husband, your cousins, and your parents, and your what have yous anymore, then and you instead rely on the state's welfare, right? Now there's a very sort of nasty element to this if you've got a humanitarian sort of bent, which is that, let's look at employment, right? Now there's a problem in South Africa that is fairly huge, and it's been going on for 100 years, which is you get hold of some labor, some cheap labor that comes from some village or what have you, and they work very hard for a little while. But then they start developing some micro industries locally, or they settle in and they find a way to make things work. They work a little bit less hard because honestly, job security they've got a couple of other options to tide them over in between. They're not too worried, or they just get complacent, whatever the matter is. So you start importing other people, right? And you bring them into work to do that, especially a problem with seasonal farmers, right? Nowadays, this becomes radically accelerated because there's a welfare system. So the second a community becomes comfortable, and it's quicker for them to become comfortable because the second they're getting welfare in, they go like, well, okay, I can have this dual income, but what if I don't feel like working today? I'm not going to starve. So then that changes. You're no longer tied into the economic system. And I mean, these are very rational choices made by a lot of people. But it means that you grow these communities that radically outstrip the local community that actually has relational ties to another. In a system that isn't like this, individual towns stay more or less the same over time. Well, at least they don't change quite as radically. And you don't get this kind of chain migration stuff. And so
that's how you get the situation in South Africa where more than 50% or about 50% of the population is dependent on some form of government grant.
Oh, there's another dimension to this. So, look, this other dimension is democracy. So you have a democracy, and you've just handed the vote over to everybody. And at a certain, and everyone sort of understands, okay, sensible fiscal policies, don't spend too much money, whatever. And look, poor people will be taken care of by the church, by charities. Life is hard, but after crises, people rely on families. There's stresses, but things get better or work themselves out. And these things are certainly possible. But at a certain point, someone will say, but the government should help people. And I mean, this is a very normal thing for people to think. So you've got mutual aid societies. Whole Afrikaner sort of wealth was built out of mutual aid. But at a certain point, a politician will approach you and say, yeah, I'm going to give that out of the country's treasury. But that goes to
example is universities, Afrikaans universities being community-based in the regards to how they were funded and started, and then being pretty much assimilated or handed over to the state at some point.
Right. But then what happens if a politician says, listen, this is getting out of control. We need to get rid of all of this fat. It's over. No, they wouldn't last 5 minutes. You lose your votes overnight. Your entire electorate would evaporate. So it means, and nowadays we have this concept called austerity, and you can thank silly British politicians for coming up with this nonsense, right? And completely by accident, because as conservatives, we need some austerity. But now it becomes this evil, dirty word, right? So austerity means reducing the budget. Nowadays, it's like morally egregious to ever reduce budgetary spending. It's like everyone will cry that you're absolutely evil. You don't care about widows and orphans. You don't care about
austerity specifically. Now you mentioned, has become almost akin to a political swear word in South Africa. The ANC uses it almost quite literally in that sense, where they call people supporters of austerity in a derogatory sense, without even elaborating, just using that word for specifically that purpose.
Look, you can tell they're under a lot of pressure in that they're actually doing a little bit of it themselves now. So they cut, but they were careful to cut more from the provincial budgets than the national, you know. But one of the things that you can see that this becomes a ratchet. So you can only increase public government spending. This is eventually going to cause problems, right? And so eventually you hit a fiscal cliff. Now, Zimbabwe, you see this whole process in like a massive speed run, because get to power. We are going to be like the Western Europe. We are going to have free healthcare and free education, top of the line, only the best for you, my African brothers. Wait 10 years. Oh, shit, we have to take a massive loan out, because we can't afford it. Oh, wait, another 10 years. Oh, we can't afford the loans. We're going to have an IMF bailout. Oh, wait, we can't do the restructuring because then the civil service will rebel. So we can't do that. We're going to just print the money, right? Yeah. And then, oh, no, the printing money is no good. So we have to compensate our armed forces some way. Let's give them a bunch of land. Oh, we can just take it from those minorities here and there. Oh. So you get this sort of like spiral that sets in. Now, the West is much more sophisticated. You have these huge financial institutions. So the way that they compensate becomes much more... It's much more subtle, and you should have to scrutinize policies for very long to get it. Yeah. So like they hit. So the way that they dealt with the labor problem is, well, labor costs are rising too fast. Okay, well, let's just open the floodgates. 1965, we can start doing immigration from non-Western countries, and then America says, no, Western Europe, you have to do it too. Because you need to pay off your debts, all of this, so you can't have labor costs rising too hard.
But just another quick note on South Africa's welfare industrial complex. What you get there as well, then, is also the political added bonus of, if you are the ruling party, you can just pretty much threaten any voter that if we don't stay in power election, then that welfare tap is going to be closed, and you put the opposition parties in the impossible position where they can't even hint at we're going to cut even a shred of any
welfare. I mean, look, the DA is going for this balls to the wall. They're boasting that they spend 75% of all of your taxpayer money. The DA are boasting about this, remember, as their campaign promise. This is a party that gets less than 5% of the black vote. It's completely moronic. They're not going to get more popular by bribing the population, but they're still doing it. So they're telling you, we are liquidating your wealth. And I mean, the rates that people pay in the Western Cape have been rising at like an extraordinary rate, outstripping inflation for a long time. And they say, we're giving 75% of that away as free services and free houses and free all of that to, anyone who shows up. So that's the model they're advertising, because they think that
every other opposition party as well. The other opposition parties' platforms just differ in regards to what grant they are promising to increase when they get into power. No. That's just the nature of what South African politics has become. When you've got this hack of the system, where if you just increasingly make the population dependent on welfare, no political party can dare challenge that system. They all just have to say, we're just going to do it with a different flavor, but we're all going to keep building this welfare industrial complex. And it's the ANC that created that political environment.
And I mean, like now they're actually now they're trying to get a merger. So there's the faction under Helen Zille, as I understand it from my informants in the party, is going absolutely balls to the wall to try and work together with certain media outlets, shall we say, to engineer a situation where the Ramaphosa faction stays in power. He's under a lot of pressure at the moment. They want a situation where the Ramaphosa faction stays in power so that they can have a merger, and they want to get rid of the elements in the DA that don't want that to happen. So you're going to be seeing a few fireworks around election time, because from what I hear, one of the people they're targeting is they're moving a bit too fast on that question. So so the DA are going to shoot themselves in the foot this election. I don't think they're going to do quite as well as they did. They're aiming to betray their electorate very consciously. They don't give a damn, because their understanding, and I mean, like, the ruthlessness that they've shown in recent years has become extraordinary. And it's like, this is our second most right-wing party in the whole country. And they're to the left of the Democratic Party in the United States. Like, it's crazy. So, it's a very, very difficult situation. From my perspective as a Cape Independence guy, I go like, okay, cool. You lose your majority in the province. We get to force a referendum on you from Vryheidsfront Referendum Party. By the way, did make the number of signatures recently. So,
well, congratulations.
Sure, but that was such a last-minute thing. Hey? That was hair-raising.
It appeared so. It seems like you guys were burning the midnight oil on that one.
No, it was nuts, because the guys in the referendum party actually contacted the IEC, said, "Can we do just digital signatures? Is this okay?" And they said, "Absolutely, go. Fill your boots." And so they did that ahead of time,
and
nice and tidy.
Lads, we're not sleeping for the next few hours.
Yeah, and then they hand it in, and then the IEC says, "Sorry, for your computer says no," and everyone just like bricks it. So the party goes to the courts, and meanwhile, supporters of the party organize a secondary signature process, and that breaks the requirements within the deadline. So we're going to see what happens. Sorry, I'm going on from a tangent here.
Just to bring it back to South Africa and the topic. Please. You said earlier that you're starting to change your mind. I remember, I think it was you that said maybe a little bit of tongue in cheek, but you said that South Africa appears to be a country that's being used as an experiment to see how bad unemployment and welfare dependence can get before there's some type of destabilization or revolt. And I mean, let's just update the experiment. Let's just look at the scorecard or at the scoreboard. At the moment, over or around 50% of South Africans are dependent on some form of government grant, and unemployment, expanded definition, is between 40 and 50%.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, that one I don't have any evidence for. I haven't ever found a policy document that says, "Oh no, South Africa shows this." Because I mean, if they were doing it, it would be way too cynical. It's like the kind of thing you couldn't do in public.
Yeah. No, I'm not putting it on the table as this was as serious as thesis of yours, but it is an interesting comment.
No, but I think it makes sense, because if you were looking at, because what's the big talk in What's the big talk in the West at the moment? Like the top levels, the ones who sort of masturbate themselves to death at Davos every couple of years. They're talking about, like, automation is going to replace every human being on the planet. We only need machines. We're going to have all of these useless mouths to feed, right? Yeah. So they've been floating ideas like universal basic income and central bank digital currency, so that they can basically steer all of these mindless sort of passive consumers to paying money, to buying products that allow you to centrally manage the economy, right? So you've got these kind of ideas. And then you go look at South Africa and you go, well, they've got the worst unemployment in the world. So, I mean, wouldn't that be a good way of looking at what life's going to be like in the future? Mm-hmm. So it just makes sense to me that they would look at us.
Yeah, but I mean that's why I call this stream. I named it after one of my things that I often say, where if Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, then South Africa is the laboratory of empires. But it doesn't mean that it has to be a laboratory where there's actively a scientist manipulating what's going on. It might just be an observation of an experiment that plays itself out by itself. But to add two more case studies.
There is something concrete you can say on this point, and it's not about modern South Africa, because here now it gets a bit fuzzy, and I think we'll have to wait a few years for us to find where the important policy decisions and research was done and sift that out and see if there's any connection. But if we look back in time, we can see some very big ones. And the big one is the Carnegie Report in 1932 on, what do they call it? The poor white problem. So they looked at all of the, poor indigent white people who've been chased off their farms that were burnt in the world wars, and those communities, a generation on, are still living.
You're talking about the Anglo-Boer War.
Correct. And, just 15 years prior, they'd had an armed uprising against the state. So it's like, okay, well...
Pretty much an Afrikaner civil war, 1914, 1915.
Correct. So they have, and there's recently been this massive sort of workers' uprising on the Rand, white Communist Party for a white South Africa, that whole thing. So they look at this. So the thing is that the solution to this is do the welfare state. So, right? But the Carnegie Foundation is one of the most powerful and influential groups in the United States. And this study comes in just before FDR makes it into power. Now, at the time, I mean, I've scanned some of his brains trust things, and I'm not an expert on this area, but I've noticed that the big focus was not on, can we do welfare? But, how do we solve unemployment? So in South Africa, that becomes an extra. I suspect that added emphasis to anyone who was thinking about welfare as an option, right? But the main thing was about how do we mimic what the Soviet Union and fascist Italy and Folkhem Sweden are doing. Those are the three countries that his brains trust were looking at as economic models. How do you centralize the state's control of the economy, but they don't want to do what the Soviet Union is doing, right? So Italy becomes a very influential model. And it's funny because you look at the people who are making these policies in the brains trust, and they're like left-wing guys who are looking at fascist Italy. It's like this weird combo. So I think the friend-enemy distinction lines weren't as hard and fast drawn back then as they are now. But you do see this influence from that sort of cluster of think tanks. And yeah, I mean, the other thing that's influential is around the same time you have maybe actually I think it's a bit later. I think he published in the 40s. There's someone called Hutt. I can't remember his first name. He's a big economist, and he looked at the effect of the color bar on the cost of labor and the effectiveness of labor. And he says, we're imposing a color bar
in South Africa.
Yeah, exactly, in the South African mines. And he says, well, you have this reduction. It's a hugely influential economic study. It's like a foundational thing in you read everywhere in almost every university's economic course. And he basically says, well, if you have a color bar, it actually reduces the sort of efficiency of your economy. And so I think the interesting thing is Nick Land is this very interestingly crazy philosopher. So he sort of wrote in 1989, he says, well, South Africa actually looks like the colonial world, but like made miniature. It's like a tiny little scale model of the Western world and its third world peripheral economic periphery. So you use, but Europe and America, they export, they put their factories overseas to Carnegie Foundation. Yes, that's correct. So they put their factories over in the colonies and had the work over there. And what we did is we brought the workers into us because you can drive from one point in the country to the other. Bring them in, work a little bit, please go home. Thank you very much. And so this kind of relationship where you try and keep the economy proximal but socially distant, that model, he sort of says, well, this is the same. And this is something that's been noticed on the left a lot. They call it colonialism of a special type and all this. It's actually, we have to learn to look at the left and say, well, actually, they've got a point there. This makes sense descriptively, but that's not how you solve the problem. That's kind of the best approach, in my opinion. So the other thing they do is they talk, settler colonies are all alike. Well, not exactly alike, but they have many similar qualities. We have to acknowledge this, right? And so this is a thing where you can learn a lot by comparing South Africa and America, and there are points of communication. And I think social stuff aside, we learned almost everything we had to know about mining from American engineers from California in the whatever it was, late 1800s, early 1900s. And then later on, as we started taking the lead technically, we exported those ideas to mineral producers in the rest of the world. Still today, you've got Saudi Arabia making special deals with South Africa to learn from the way that we do mining. So
that whole idea of South Africa being the world in miniature, it's an idea that I keep encountering it, and I'm not just reading within within South African literature. I'm reading it from everywhere. I mean, Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, he in the 1940s wrote that the white minority in South Africa represents a microcosm of the West in the world, and what happens in South Africa could be an important indicator for the future of the West. And even more contemporarily, Flip Buys of the Solidarity Movement wrote that South Africa could possibly be the first large grouping of Westerners living in a post-Western country. And then just lastly, another place where I encountered it in my reading was when I was reading M.P. van Wyk Louw, and he wrote in the 1950s. He said that he took a different angle. He took a cultural angle where he said that he explored the idea, I think, a little bit with a little bit of speculation, not putting all his chips on that bet. But he said that maybe he posed the question, maybe it is the Afrikaners' fate in the bigger Western picture or the Western world to provide the insights of how a small Western minority interacts with radically different cultures around them, and to serve as almost a case study for the West to learn from in that regard, from the Afrikaners, both successes and failures in that regard. Because
I mean, one of the other things that you'll notice is that, I mean, the how should I put it, the ethnocentrism of Afrikaners who were much closer to, I almost used that old cliche, closer to the coal face, although I think that's a bit of a risque metaphor in our current context. They're a bit closer to the meniscus between the two fluids, between black society and white society, because traditionally, Anglos have been city dwelling. They've been very city dwelling. They've been sort of
tied to an empire, tied to a homeland far away, never cutting that umbilical cord.
But finance and service industry, even if they're not internationally connected or minded, there is a more metropolitan aspect to South African Anglos, with some exceptions. I mean, we know what the Eastern Cape is like, but there's this thing of like, if your society is very closely tied to the ends of production, where you're encountering this in Southern Africa, in the white community, if you're encountering black society much more, the differences become much more apparent. And you can see this in old colonial reports. I mean, even the Germans in Southwest Africa having communications with people back in Germany. And Germans have always been big Afrophiles. I mean, even today, it's like, even under the Nazis, you get these postcards like, come and enjoy, come and enjoy the women from this part. Very bizarre. You'd sort of think this Aryan purity would go all the way down to the core, but it doesn't quite. I think the Germans have always had a thing for Africa. But today, linguists, 85% of 85% of all linguists studying African languages are German. So, but you get this relationship where a cosmopolitan German sort of administrator would be talking to a colonial officer, and the colonial officer would say, these people are like terrible. We can have nothing to do with them. We share no values, nothing. And the administrator says, horrible. They are human beings. And it's this interesting thing of you'd expect people who have, if you listen to liberal society, you get this impression that people who have no contact with the other will be the most hostile. No, it's actually the ones that have the most contact with the other. And you can see it now in the West, that increasing contact with multi-ethnic society is driving a revival of old ideas of sort of ethno-nationalism. So we're seeing this kind of stuff come back. It takes, these things move very slowly, so it's hard to say where everything will go. They might do the same thing as the Afrikaners did in the 90s and just despair. I mean, we all know, we all know what's happened in the past 30 years. It's been sort of a combination of despair and apathy. Well, there's nothing we can do, kind of thing. I think, AfriForum and Solidarity can sort of congratulate themselves on achieving something that's quite extraordinary in changing that mindset, especially in the recent years. So you've seen, I think one of the biggest indicators is Day of the Vow, where the Geloftesdag celebrations, which, in the late 90s, early 2000s, were like they could barely fill the Voortrekker Monument, and now it's like hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah. Well, actually, I looked into that. So I found, or the people at the Voortrekker Monument found the older Beeld article that documented that in 1994, only 250 Afrikaners showed up to the Voortrekker Monument for the Day of the Vow. That's insane to think about, but it was documented. Then in 2019, you have 10 to 12,000, which was already record-breaking, not record in all time, but for 21st century. Then 2022, you have 20,000, because you have to factor in between 2019 and 2022, you have the whole COVID epidemic, and then or pandemic. And then in 2023, last year, we had 32,000 Afrikaners showing up at the Voortrekker Monument for the Day of the Vow. The third most Afrikaners that have ever in the history of the Voortrekker Monument showed up for the Day of the Vow at the monument. And you have to take into account, just for perspective, in that top three, the other two includes the 250,000 that showed up at the inauguration of the monument itself.
No, I've seen footage of that. It's very impressive. But I mean, look, this is a general sort of thing that to look at, is that national feeling comes from, I think it's two things. And it's not always pretty. It can be very, very ugly. I don't want anyone to sort of think I'm selling everyone a fucking rainbow here. Excuse my language. But it comes from two things, and I think the left are right to say that it is dangerous, because it is dangerous. We are playing with fire right now. We are playing with fire, and the reason we're playing with fire is because, well, we are getting very cold and the lights are going out. So and I think, the rest of society in South Africa is playing with the same fire. You can look at black nationalism coming back. You can look at tribalism coming back. And this is a product of the failures of this multiracial society, this multi-ethnic society. And everybody really wants to get along deep down. I mean, I think so, at least. Either that or be left alone, whichever one. I think the desires overlap a lot. But I think there's a lot of people in South Africa who desperately want it all to work and get along. But increasingly people are going, no, it's not working. Just because, okay, it doesn't matter what we want, it matters what's real. And that's the hard step to make, because
it's the world as it is, rather than the world as we desperately want it to be.
And I think, look, you have to sort of take your I think a lot of people on the right sort of go like, at least, should we say conservatives, people who are not completely off the deep end. Conservatives want to say, no, look, we're not doing anything dangerous, we're fine. And I think, no, you've got to admit that at some level there is a risk that going in this direction will unleash monsters of a sort. And the really sort of scary thing to realize is that, sometimes you have to become a bit of a monster in order to survive. And we hope that never is what we're forced to do, because, well, everyone who's ever been through a war, with some rare exceptions, sort of says, well, no, this is horrific. Let's not do that again. But unfortunately, sometimes you have to fight for things. And fortunately for us, there are ways available to us for securing a situation without the need for warfare. And we kind of have to sort it out without warfare because balance of forces are not in our favor. So in a way, we are kind of given an opportunity to build our own homes very quietly if we're diligent about it. I mean, I'm starting work on an aspect of the Anchor Towns program for solidarity at the moment, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's, we're just building our homes quietly away from where things are very dangerous. And it's my hope that we can get that particular combination that generates this particular nationalist feeling, which is the others don't like us and we can't make them like us, okay? And then finding something to hope for and having a positive feeling about your effect in the world. So those two combinations is like positive energy for yourself, not necessarily for the other. And, doesn't sound very sexy to someone who's on the liberal side of things, but it's kind of necessary for people to get up off their bums and do something. And I don't mind if others think that way, as long as they're not hurting me. And I would prefer us not to hurt others. This is the way things are supposed to be. You look after. I mean, you don't expect your family and your neighbor's family to form one family. No, you quietly sort of get about your own business. You collaborate where you have to. You fight where you have to fight. But generally speaking, you get along at a distance. And I think that's sort of how things are going to end up if things go down an okay path. There are bad paths that we are facing now with forced integration stuff, where the pressure eventually builds up and either someone gets crushed or swings back. And that's not a situation I want to see. I would like to see there be pressure valves for releasing this tension. And I think that what Solidarity has been doing so far is really to seek realistic means of achieving this. Unfortunately, I think some people are getting impatient. And I think we all know who we're talking about here. And I would desperately hope that they find a way not to fight with the organization and with the majority of the society, and find a niche where they can build things and do good work, where they see there's gaps necessary. But I think it's a bit late in the day for people to be fighting for control of the movement. I think at this stage it's a situation where we don't have a lot of time to build, and we all have to have a concerted effort.
So find your niche where you can build something that you think is not getting the attention it deserves.
Exactly. And there's no room for fighting. There's no room for infighting, and there's no room for fighting outside either. There's no fighting. No fighting. Just
no fighting to this side of the Boereworsgordijn.
Exactly. And it's like, the same thing goes for Cape Independence as well. I mean, there's some people there's a lot of people who sort of think, well, no, we need to sort of get like a whole bunch of like really, really sort of like fierce nationalist types. And I think, okay, I understand where you're coming from because you're worried about bad things happening. But really, this is something where quiet, get along, make it as peaceful as possible, figure things out slowly. I mean, people often get, we've all had those feelings where you have a little bit of panic and then you think, oh, maybe I must do something drastic. Wait, hang on. So drastic action is something you really don't want to do. And and if you're lucky, you won't have to ever take drastic action, and you'll have built something nice and cozy and you can just watch the rain outside the window.
Well, that's, I think there we can say that that concludes the introduction to tonight's conversation. Now let's start with Roads Must Fall and what that entailed. So no, Rob, I actually just want to end with a quote from Flip Base in that regard. When you mentioned rain, as you said, just because the storm is raging outside and it's very loud, the thunder and the lightning, doesn't mean that there's not communities and people building in the rain. The soft rain of building isn't falling on the fertile ground, and that's what you're describing there. But Rob, thank you very much for your insights here tonight. Thank you for your time. I'm going to have to invite you back on closer to the election, maybe to talk a bit about Cape Independence and the referendum party. I'm quite interested in your takes there as well. But that's a conversation I'd like to silo for the future.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a more of a free agent because I'm so I can because I have a foot in all of the camps, so I can kind of speak a bit more freely about what's going on.
Right.
than most. Yeah.
Yeah. So my last question to you, Rob, is just where can people find your work if is the first time that they're hearing some of your
Oh,
ideas?
cool. Well, look, I have a blog that I don't update very often anymore because you can go there and read some of my old stuff, which is a bit more philosophical, long form essays and all of that kind of stuff. That ran from, I did a lot of it to try and reflect on the ideas I was getting rid of as I, moved away from the far left. And then, so you can read that. It's Marobane at Substack, Marhobane. And then at the moment, I do almost all of my writing on a website called the Cape Independent, where I do daily news and sort of analysis and stuff of current events from a Cape national perspective. And I had a very interesting phone call earlier, and I might have a couple of little scoops here and there over the next week or two. Go read that if you want to read something that is slightly out of the ordinary for South African newspapers. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Rob. Thanks again for your insights. And lastly, thank you for everyone that tuned in. Thank you for your comments and thank you for taking part in the conversation. If you're new here you like these types of conversations, you can subscribe. And if you like this conversation, you can leave a like. But also, you can still take part in the conversation, even if it's no longer live. You can leave your comments and your thoughts in the comments section. I read all of them and really appreciate your feedback.
Smash that like button.
You heard the man. All right, Rob, I hope you have an excellent rest of your evening. Good luck with the family and blessings to you in the week ahead.
Yeah, man. Cheers. See you in Pretoria.
Yeah, I'll definitely have a Kaya again real soon. Looking forward to it. Right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one and God bless.
All right.